The night Adrian Cole vanished, the city outside his penthouse window shimmered with neon lights. But inside his chest, there was only darkness. Success had been his lifelong armor. Every award, every headline, every contract signed had built a wall between him and the chaos of emotion. To his investors, he was flawless. To the public, he was a self-made empire. But to the two women whose trembling voices haunted him that evening, he was something else entirely. A man who had changed their lives forever, then disappeared before he could face the weight of what he had done. It began with a phone call that fractured his world in a way he never expected. First, it was Marissa. Her voice shook as she spoke, yet beneath the tremor was unshakable resolve. "Adrian, we need to talk," she said. He felt the stiffness in her tone, the kind that warned of truths too heavy to ignore. Before he could even gather his words, another call flashed on his screen. A second name, Alara. He hadn't heard from her in weeks. His chest tightened as he answered, and what she said made time tilt sideways. "Adrian, I'm pregnant." He sat frozen, both phones silent now. The world outside still buzzing with lights and cars and endless ambition. Two women, two children on the way, two lives intertwined with his. The man who lived for control suddenly found himself standing on the edge of something uncontrollable. His mind raced the way it always did, calculating risks, mapping exits, weighing outcomes, stay and be consumed by responsibility, or vanish, disappear into the folds of his business where no one could touch him. By the end of the week, the decision was made. He left. Adrian told himself it was temporary. He told himself he had pressing ventures overseas: Tokyo, Dubai, London, cities where no one knew his mistakes, where he could hide behind contracts and endless negotiations. He buried himself in numbers, in flights that blurred into one another, in hotel rooms that all smelled the same. Each night he convinced himself that Marissa and Alara were strong enough to handle life without him. He convinced himself that absence was mercy, that staying away was somehow less damaging than being a fractured presence in their lives. But the truth is, silence becomes its own kind of noise. He lay awake in luxury suites, staring at ceilings, imagining the sound of tiny heartbeats he'd never heard, of cries he'd never comforted. He avoided the thought long enough. That months stretched into years. 3 years, to be exact. And yet, guilt never really sleeps. It waits. The encounter came without warning, on a day that should have been ordinary. Adrian had returned to the city to negotiate a hospital investment, the irony heavy even before fate stepped in. A man who abandoned his own family now sat at a table pitching support for programs that cared for families. He moved through the hospital lobby with his usual calm authority, every step echoing the life he had crafted. He thought he was untouchable. Then he saw her. Marissa, sitting on a bench near the wide glass windows, her hair tied back simply, a calm strength about her that nearly knocked the air from his lungs. She wasn't alone. At her side were 2 children, a boy carefully stacking blocks with a quiet focus, and a girl tugging playfully at her mother's hand. Their laughter filled the air, light but piercing, and when the little girl turned her face, Adrian's entire body froze. Her eyes, his eyes, the same shade, the same tilt, unmistakable. For a moment, the bustling lobby fell away. He wasn't the CEO, the empire builder, the man in control. He was simply a man staring at what could have been, what should have been, what he had run from. His chest constricted with a force so overwhelming he could barely breathe. Every wall he had built over the last 3 years cracked in that instant. Marissa lifted her gaze and met his. There was no shock in her eyes, no stumble of recognition. She looked at him as though she had expected this day all along, not with fury, not with pleading, but with a steady, unshaken stare that said, "You can't outrun this forever." Adrian wanted to speak, but no words came. He wanted to take a step forward, but his feet felt locked in cement. The boy paused his stacking, glancing up with cautious eyes that mirrored someone Adrian once knew. The girl tilted her head, curiously, just as Adrian used to when puzzled. It was like seeing his own reflection split into 2 tiny forms, children who belonged to a world he had denied himself. Marissa stood slowly, placing a protective hand on each of them. Her voice was steady, almost too calm for the storm raging. In him, "You're late, Adrian." He felt the words like a strike to the chest, late for birthdays, for first steps, for sleepless nights, for every moment he had traded for boardrooms and cold hotel beds. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but none felt worthy of the silence he had left behind. Still, he took a step, then another, each one heavier than the last, as if dragging the weight of 3 vanished years behind him. The children watched with curiosity but without recognition. To them, he was a stranger. To him, they were everything he had run from, everything he had convinced himself he didn't need, now staring back at him with unspoken truth. The air between them was thick with all that had been unsaid. Marissa didn't falter. She motioned toward a quieter corner of the lobby. "We should talk. You owe them that much." And for the first time in his life, Adrian Cole, the man who always dictated the terms, who always set the rules followed without argument, he knew he had no right to demand anything. But he also knew this was the moment his carefully constructed life would either break apart completely or finally begin to heal. He didn't know yet if forgiveness was possible. He didn't know if redemption could ever be earned. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away again, not this time. The story of Adrian Cole didn't end with success, with skyscrapers, with headlines. It began again in that hospital lobby, with 2 children staring curiously at the man who had once chosen absence over love. And as he followed Marissa into the unknown, the silence he had lived with for 3 years finally broke not with words, but with the sound of hope creeping back into a heart he thought was long gone. Adrian followed Marissa through the wide corridor, his footsteps echoing louder than he wanted them to. Every beat of his shoes against the polished floor felt like an accusation. For years he had hidden behind deals, signatures, and the language of success. But now he found himself powerless in the presence of 2 children who carried pieces of his soul. His throat was dry, words trembling inside him but refusing to come out. Marissa led him into a quiet lounge, away from the rush of the hospital. The children trailed behind her, the boy gripping her sweater with one hand while holding a small block in the other. Unwilling to part with his treasure, the girl skipped, carefree in her innocence, unaware of the storm pressing in around the adults. Adrian's chest tightened at the sight. He had missed all of it, their laughter, their first words, the way they looked at their mother with absolute trust. Marissa turned, her eyes fixed on him with calm intensity. 3 years, Adrian. Not a letter, not a call, nothing. She didn't raise her voice, but the quietness in her tone carried more weight than shouting ever could. He opened his mouth, but what excuse could he possibly offer? That he had been scared, that he convinced himself staying away was better? Weakness had never been a word he associated with himself, but in front of her, in front of them, he was stripped bare of every mask. The little girl tugged at Marissa's hand, whispering something that Adrian couldn't hear. Marissa bent down, listened, then nodded with a small smile. The girl turned to him, her blue eyes studying his face with curiosity. "Mommy, who is he?" The question cut him deeper than any accusation could. The boy's eyes flicked to his sister, then to Adrian, silent but searching. Adrian felt his heart pound against his ribs. They didn't know him. He was nothing more than a stranger who happened to share their features. Marissa straightened, her shoulders squared as though bracing herself. "This is Adrian," she said softly, her gaze never leaving his. "He's someone you'll learn about in time." The girl tilted her head in the same way Adrian used to when he was puzzled, a gesture that stole his breath. The boy, quieter but more perceptive, seemed to sense something beneath the words. He clutched his block tighter, his small knuckles whitening. Adrian finally spoke, his voice low, almost breaking. "I don't deserve to be here." Marissa's eyes flashed, but not with anger. "With truth. You're right. You don't. But they do. They deserve to know who you are. They deserve answers." Silence hung heavy in the air. The children had already gone back to their play, their laughter softening the edges of the moment. Adrian watched them stack blocks together, giggling when the tower toppled. For a fleeting second, he saw what he had missed, the small victories, the shared jokes, the bond that had grown in his absence. "I thought leaving would protect them," he said finally, his words halting. "I thought, if I stayed away, they wouldn't feel the weight of my flaws. I told myself you were strong enough to raise them without me." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "But the truth is, I was running from myself." Marissa's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "I didn't need perfection, Adrian. I needed presence. They needed a father. And you." Her gaze hardened. "You chose absence." Her words landed like stones, but he didn't flinch. He knew they were true. He had built a life on calculated decisions. But this was one calculation that had shattered everything. The boy crawled onto Marissa's lap, resting his head against her shoulder. The girl climbed beside them, her laughter fading into content silence. The three of them fit together seamlessly, a picture of a family whole without him. Adrian felt the sting of reality. He was the outsider, the man who had willingly given up his place. Still, something inside him stirred, a faint flicker that refused to die. For the first time in years, he didn't want to run. He didn't want to bury himself in the comfort of boardrooms and distant cities. He wanted to fight for something real, even if he didn't deserve a second chance. "Let me try," he whispered, almost to himself. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. But let me try to know them, even if it's just as a friend, even if it's just from a distance." Marissa studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for the man she once thought she knew. Finally, she exhaled slowly, her hand brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "They're not just names on paper, Adrian. They're lives. They've grown without you. If you want to step into their world, it can't be halfway. It can't be another promise that disappears the moment it gets hard." He nodded, her words piercing him with a truth he couldn't deny. For the first time, he wasn't negotiating terms. He was begging for the smallest thread of a chance. The boy looked up then, his eyes wide and unguarded. "Do you build towers too?" he asked softly, holding up his block. Adrian's throat tightened. He knelt down, lowering himself to their level. "I used to," he said, forcing a small smile. "But maybe you can teach me again." The boy studied him, then handed him the block. It was such a simple gesture, yet to Adrian it felt like a door cracking open, a door he thought would remain sealed forever. The girl giggled, pulling another block from her small bag and placing it in his hand. "Then you can play with us," she declared. Marissa watched quietly, her eyes unreadable. But somewhere in the depths of her gaze, Adrian thought he saw the faintest glimmer of something, maybe not forgiveness, but perhaps the first fragile step toward it. As the three of them built a small tower together, laughter mixing with silence, Adrian realized something that struck deeper than all his years of success. Skyscrapers could crumble, empires could fall, but these small hands offering him a second chance, this was the foundation he had been missing all along. Yet deep down, he also knew this was only the beginning. Winning contracts was easy, earning back trust, that would be the hardest battle of his life. And as he glanced at Marissa, who still guarded her heart behind walls of quiet strength, he understood that the journey ahead would test every part of him. The question wasn't whether he could afford to stay, it was whether he could finally choose not to run again. For the first time in years, Adrian wanted to stay. He didn't know if he could repair what was broken. But as his daughter's laughter echoed and his son pressed another block into his hand, he felt something he hadn't in so long: hope. Adrian woke the next morning with a restlessness he hadn't felt in years. Sleep had been fleeting, broken by images of two small faces looking at him with curiosity, and of Marissa's steady eyes that carried both unspoken strength and unhealed wounds. He had closed deals worth billions, stood on stages before thousands, and spoken with unwavering confidence to the world's most powerful leaders. But the weight of those moments in the hospital lobby made all of that feel insignificant. For the first time, his victories felt hollow compared to the fragile thread of connection he had nearly lost forever. He found himself standing outside a small park later that afternoon, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He had asked Marissa if he could see the children again. She hadn't agreed immediately. She had studied him for a long time, her silence stretching like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. Finally, she had said, "If you're serious, then prove it. No grand speeches, no promises you'll run from tomorrow. Just show up." And so he had. From the distance, he spotted them, the little girl racing toward the swings, her laughter carrying through the crisp air, and the boy walking carefully beside her. Gripping a toy car tightly as if it were treasure, Marissa followed. A step behind, her gaze moving constantly, protective yet calm. Adrian hesitated, his legs heavy. But when the girl looked up and saw him, she pointed with unfiltered excitement. "It's him, the man who builds towers." Adrian's chest tightened at her words. To her, he wasn't a stranger anymore. He wasn't yet a father, but he was something. And that was more than he deserved, but it was also more than he thought he would ever have again. The boy looked up too, cautious, his toy car clutched even tighter. He didn't run forward like his sister. He studied Adrian, waiting, testing. The silent weight in his eyes was almost too much to bear, as though he carried questions bigger than his small frame. Could hold. Adrian knelt as they approached, lowering himself so his eyes met theirs. "I came to play, if you let me." The girl grinned, already grabbing his hand to pull him toward the swings. The boy lingered back, his silence unbroken. Adrian didn't press. He had spent years running from moments like this. Now he knew patience would be his only chance at redemption. Marissa sat on a bench nearby, her arms folded, watching. She didn't intervene, didn't guide the children's reactions. This was their choice. Adrian knew she was testing him, waiting to see if he would falter, if his presence would crumble as quickly as his promises once had. The girl squealed with delight as Adrian pushed her gently on the swing, her small legs pumping through the air. Every giggle felt like a gift, every moment etched into his chest. But it was the boy who drew his attention most. He sat in the sandbox, pushing his toy car through the sand in careful lines. His concentration was deep, but every so often he looked up at Adrian, his eyes sharp, searching for something unspoken. Adrian left the swing and crouched near the sandbox. "That's a strong car you've got there. Where's it headed?" The boy shrugged, his lips pressed together. For a moment, Adrian thought he would remain silent, but then a small voice came, hesitant but clear. "Nowhere. It just goes." Adrian nodded slowly. "Sometimes I felt like that too," he admitted, "like I was going everywhere. But really, I wasn't going anywhere that mattered." The boy didn't answer, but his eyes softened slightly. He pushed the car again, this time letting it roll toward Adrian's hand. A simple act, but it broke something inside him. He picked up the car, turning it in his hand carefully, then set it back down so the boy could keep playing. Marissa's gaze lingered on the exchange. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. The afternoon stretched on, the air cooling as the sun began to sink. The children played until their laughter gave way to yawns and rubbing eyes. Marissa gathered them close, slipping jackets over their small shoulders. Adrian stood awkwardly, unsure whether he had earned the right to stay longer or if his presence had been tolerated enough for one day. "We should go," Marissa said, her tone neutral. Adrian nodded, stepping back. But then the girl ran to him, her arms outstretched. Without thinking, he bent down, and she hugged him tightly round the neck. His heart nearly shattered under the weight of that embrace. "You'll come again, right?" she asked. His throat tightened. He looked at Marissa, seeking permission. She didn't speak, but she didn't shake her head either. That silence was enough. He nodded to the little girl, whispering, "Yes, I'll be here." As they walked away, the boy glanced back once, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered a second longer than before. That night, Adrian sat alone in his penthouse, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him. For years he had believed this view was enough, that success was measured in glass towers and glowing lights. Now, it all felt empty. What good were empires if the foundation of his own life had been left to crumble? He thought of Marissa, her quiet strength. He thought of the boy's cautious eyes, of the girl's laughter. He thought of the years he had missed, the first words, the first steps, the birthdays, the countless little moments that stitched a family together. And for the first time, he didn't just feel guilt. He felt hunger, hunger for a life he had abandoned, for bonds he had yet to earn, for the chance to rewrite what he had once destroyed. But Adrian knew this wouldn't be simple. A visit to the park wasn't redemption. A smile from his daughter wasn't forgiveness. The world didn't change overnight. Marissa didn't trust him yet, and perhaps she never would. He had vanished once. What guarantee could he offer that he wouldn't vanish again? And beyond Marissa stood an even greater challenge: the world outside. People remembered. They whispered. A CEO who had everything, yet abandoned what mattered most. Already, rumors were beginning to stir. Associates raised their eyebrows when they saw him near the hospital, near Marissa. Old acquaintances spoke with curiosity, others with judgment. And if the children one day asked why he left, what could he possibly say? Still, he couldn't ignore the pull in his chest. He had lived in exile from his own heart for too long. Now, for the first time in years, he wanted to stay. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cold glass of the window. The city lights blurred, no longer symbols of his victories, but reminders of all he had traded. Tomorrow would bring challenges, conversations, resistance. But tonight, he clung to the memory of his daughter's arms around his neck, of his son's toy car rolling toward him as if offering a fragile truce. He whispered into the silence, a promise not to the city, not to himself, but to them: "I won't run again." And though no one was there to hear it, the words felt like the first step on a path he had never thought. He would take the path back to the life he had almost lost forever. Adrian didn't expect rebuilding a life to feel heavier than building an empire. The morning he returned to the office, he carried more than his briefcase. He carried the weight of promises, made silently in a hospital lobby and a park. The boardroom had always been his battlefield, a place where his voice carried authority and every gesture radiated control. But that day, he couldn't stop seeing the way his daughter's small arms wrapped around his neck, or the cautious way his son had handed him a toy car. Numbers on the spreadsheets blurred, and for the first time in years, he found himself distracted, not by competition, but by the thought of bedtime stories and laughter he had missed. By noon, whispers were already spreading through the city. It didn't take long for people to notice him in places he hadn't been seen before: near the park, near the hospital, near Marissa. Associates and journalists were quick to stir the ashes of a story that had never fully died: the CEO who vanished without explanation, leaving behind rumors of broken ties and abandoned responsibilities. Adrian had spent 3 years avoiding that truth. Now it walked beside him everywhere he went. Later that week, he found himself back at Marissa's door. He stood outside for a long time, rehearsing what to say, how to explain, though no words seemed adequate. Finally, he knocked. The door opened, and the boy stood there, clutching his car, staring at him with cautious curiosity. Behind him, Marissa appeared, her eyes narrowing slightly, her voice steady. "You're back sooner than I thought." Adrian nodded. "I told her I would be. I meant it." Her gaze searched his, as though trying to measure the weight of his sincerity. Then she stepped aside, allowing him in. The children were sprawled on the floor with toys, laughter filling the small space in a way that made Adrian's chest ache. He lowered himself to the carpet, awkward at first, until the girl pressed a doll into his hand, declaring, "You can play too." The boy hesitated, then nudged his toy car toward Adrian again, silently granting him permission to stay. Hours passed in that simple rhythm of play and conversation, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt more human than powerful. But the peace didn't last. After the children had drifted to sleep, Marissa turned to him, her expression sharp. "You can't just walk in and out when you feel like it. They're not a distraction, Adrian. They're not something you fit between meetings. If you're here, you're here. Otherwise, don't come back." The words cut him deeply, but he nodded. "I know. And I don't want to leave again." Her lips pressed into a line. "Wanting isn't enough. You have to prove it, not just to me, but to them." The days that followed tested every part of him. At work, his colleagues noticed the change: his phone no longer glued to his ear, his evenings no longer consumed by endless dinners with investors. He started arriving late or leaving early, something the Adrian of 3 years ago would never have allowed. But while his empire wobbled at the edges, something else slowly began to take root. At the park, his daughter raced to greet him without hesitation, climbing into his arms with laughter that erased years of absence in a single breath. His son remained cautious, but each day the wall between them grew thinner. The boy began to let Adrian push his toy car alongside his own, and eventually, they built tracks together, long winding paths in the sand that mirrored the beginnings of trust. Still, the outside world wasn't forgiving. Gossip spread quickly, articles speculating about his sudden involvement in the lives he had once ignored, questions from business associates about his distractions. At one gala, a fellow executive sneered quietly, "You're losing your edge, Cole. You used to chase towers, not playgrounds." Adrian didn't respond, but later that night, as he tucked his daughter's blanket around her while she slept, he realized something profound. He wasn't losing his edge. He was finally finding it in places that mattered. Marissa noticed the changes too, though she rarely voiced them. One evening, she lingered at the kitchen doorway while Adrian sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as his daughter told him about her favorite storybook. The look in Marissa's eyes was complicated, part guarded, part softened by a flicker of hope she tried to hide. Still, she kept her walls high. Over coffee one morning, she said quietly, "You can't erase the years, Adrian. They'll always ask where you were, and when they do, what will you say?" He met her eyes unflinching. "I'll tell them the truth, that I was wrong, that I ran, that I thought I was protecting them, but I was only protecting myself, and I'll tell them. I came back because I couldn't stay gone anymore." Her silence lingered, but she didn't turn away. That, he realized, was its own kind of progress. The hardest moment came when his daughter, her voice full of innocence, asked him one night, "Where were you before?" The question stopped him cold. He glanced at Marissa, who simply folded her arms, waiting to see how he would answer. Adrian swallowed hard. He took a deep breath, lowering himself to meet his daughter's eyes. "I made a mistake," he said softly. "I thought I had to go far away, but I should have been here with you. I can't change that I left, but I can promise you this: I won't leave again." She seemed to consider his words, then smiled in the way only a child could, full of forgiveness that adults struggled to give. She climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. His heart broke and healed all at once. His son didn't say anything that night, but when Adrian stood to leave, the boy pressed his toy car into Adrian's hand. "Keep it," he whispered. It was the first time he had spoken to him without hesitation. Adrian nearly wept at the small act of trust. He realized then that redemption wasn't earned in speeches or grand gestures. It was earned block by block, car by car, moment by moment, in the quiet trust of children and the guarded hope of a woman who had once loved him. But he also knew the story was far from over. The world around them would keep watching, questioning, judging, and sooner or later, the shadows of his past, Alara's absence, the unanswered questions, the choices he had buried would come pressing forward. As he sat alone that night, the boy's toy car still warm in his hand, Adrian whispered into the darkness, "I will not vanish again." The words weren't just a promise anymore. They were a vow, binding him to a path that would test him more than any empire ever had. And though the future loomed uncertain, he knew he was ready to fight for it, not as a CEO, not as a man of wealth, but as someone learning, for the first time, how to be a father, how to be present, and how to face the consequences of the years he could never reclaim. The night had a silence that unsettled Adrian. It wasn't the calm of peace, but the quiet before something long buried clawed its way back. For weeks, he had been rebuilding fragile connections, stacking small bricks of trust with Marissa and the children. But deep down, he knew there was another part of the story waiting in the shadows. He had avoided Alara for too long, avoided the questions of what happened to her, avoided facing why he vanished when both women needed him most. He had been living in half-truths. And though Marissa hadn't said it aloud, he could see the unspoken question in her eyes every time she looked at him. What about her? That unasked question haunted him now as he sat in his apartment, the toy car still resting on his desk. He stared at it until the memory of his son's voice replayed in his mind. "Keep it." That tiny voice was enough to push him toward a decision. He could not build a future while half his past remained unexplained. The next morning, he drove to the other side of the city, the place he hadn't dared visit in years. The roads looked the same, but everything felt different, like a forgotten chapter of his own life was waiting to be reopened. When he reached the small neighborhood where Alara's sister once lived, his chest tightened. For a long moment, he just sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He wasn't sure what to expect when he finally knocked on the door. The woman who opened it was older than he remembered, lines of grief etched into her face, but her eyes carried recognition instantly. "You," she said sharply, bitterness dripping from the word. Adrian lowered his gaze. "I need to know, please, about Alara." Her silence stretched, heavy and accusing. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning him in. "You don't deserve to know." But she would have wanted the truth told. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. He followed her to a small living room where photographs lined the mantel. His breath caught when he saw Alara's face smiling back at him. From one of the frames, younger and brighter. Then his memories. "She waited for you," her sister said, her voice trembling. "Even when you left without a word, she believed you'd come back. She tried to raise her child with hope in her heart, but hope doesn't feed a baby or keep the world's judgment away." Adrian's stomach dropped. "Child," his voice cracked on the word. Her sister's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, your child. A little boy. He didn't make it, Adrian. He was fragile, and she didn't have the strength or support. She carried that pain until it consumed her. She's gone too." The words hit him harder than any boardroom defeat, any financial collapse. He felt the floor tilt beneath him, his entire body hollowing out as the reality sank in. A son he never met, a woman who had waited and broken under the weight of his absence. His knees weakened, and he dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Her sister's voice grew sharp again. "You vanished, and in vanishing, you destroyed more than one life. Don't come here looking for forgiveness, you won't find it." Adrian lifted his face, tears burning his eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I needed to know, and I needed to promise, even if it means nothing now, that I won't abandon the children who are still here. I won't vanish again." Her gaze lingered on him, anger still blazing, but mixed with something reluctant and acknowledgement. Perhaps that his words carried more weight than empty promises. Still, she turned away. "You can't fix what's gone, but maybe you can. Stop ruining what's left." The drive back felt endless. He gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world, his mind reeling with the image of a child he would never see, of Alara waiting and breaking. Guilt pressed down like a storm, but beneath it was a strange kind of clarity. He understood now why every small smile from his daughter mattered, why every hesitant step from his son toward trust was a gift. They weren't just moments, they were second chances life rarely offered. That evening, when he returned to Marissa's apartment, his face gave away more than he intended. She noticed immediately. "What happened?" she asked softly. Adrian hesitated, then sat down heavily, his voice rough. "I found out what I should have faced long ago. Alara's gone. And so is the child." The air grew heavy. Marissa closed her eyes, the pain in her face reflecting not just her own grief, but the weight of what it meant for Adrian. She sank into the chair across from him. "You can't keep carrying both worlds on your shoulders," she whispered. "I don't want to carry them," Adrian said, his voice breaking. "I want to honor them, by being here, by not failing again." Marissa studied him for a long moment, her eyes wet. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Then show them every day." That night, as he tucked the children into bed, Adrian lingered longer than usual, pressing a kiss to his daughter's forehead, smoothing the blanket around his son. The boy stirred slightly, eyes half closed, and whispered, "Don't go." Adrian's throat tightened. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered back, his hand steadying on the boy's small shoulder. In the dim light of that room, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the children, Adrian made another silent vow. He could never erase the lives he had lost, but he could fight with everything in him to protect the ones still within his reach. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just saying the words, he meant them with every fractured, rebuilt piece of himself. The world outside still waited, with judgment, with whispers, with the sharp edge of scandal. But Adrian understood something now that he had never grasped in his years of power. Empires could fall and rebuild, wealth could vanish and return, But trust once lost was the rarest currency of all, and he was willing to spend every day earning it back. The city never truly slept, but that night Adrian felt as though its noise had gone quiet, leaving only the echo of his own choices. He walked through streets that once celebrated his name, billboards, articles, handshakes in glass towers, and realized how hollow those victories had become. Power had been his mask, but masks crack when truth presses against them. He had avoided the public eye for years, but now he knew hiding would not protect Marissa, nor the children. Sooner or later, the world would learn he was back, and when they did, every whisper, every headline would demand one thing: answers. And this time, Adrian had no intention of running. The first storm arrived faster than he expected. A single photo, him holding his son's small hand outside Marissa's apartment, circulated online. By morning, speculation filled every corner of the internet. Disgraced CEO returns. Vanished tycoon with secret family. The headlines were sharp, sensational, but not entirely untrue. Marissa's phone rang endlessly, her inbox filled with messages she didn't dare open. Even the children noticed, their teachers whispering to each other in corners of the classroom. Marissa's eyes held fear when she spoke to Adrian. This isn't just your burden anymore. They'll drag us into this too. Adrian took her hand, steady despite the tremor in his chest. I won't let them, not this time. They can say what they want about me, but I'll make sure they know you and the children are not for them to wound. Within days, reporters gathered outside his building, shouting questions that blurred into noise. For the first time in years, Adrian stood before flashing cameras without a security wall to shield him. The faces behind the lenses were hungry for scandal, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his voice. Yes, I vanished. Yes, I failed people who trusted me. And yes, I have children who deserve better than the man I was. I cannot rewrite what I abandoned, but I can choose what I build from this moment forward. Judge me if you must, but leave them out of it. The crowd erupted: questions, accusations, flashes of light that made his eyes burn, but his words cut through. Replayed endlessly across networks, some scoffed, others softened. For every critic calling him a fraud, another voice rose quietly to say they saw a man trying to rebuild. Yet rebuilding wasn't about speeches, it was about actions. So Adrian poured himself into proving his words true. He attended every school meeting, not as the wealthy man who could donate a new library wing, but as the father waiting in line with other parents. He learned bedtime routines, sat through tears and laughter alike, and most of all, he never walked away. Marissa noticed the change, though she didn't admit it at first. Instead, she observed quietly, as though testing whether he would break under pressure again. But the hardest test came not from her, nor from the public, but from his son. One evening, as the boy sat with crayons scattered across the floor, he looked up with wide, serious eyes. Why didn't you come sooner? The question hit harder than any headline. Adrian knelt, his throat tight. Because I was afraid. Afraid of being weak, afraid of failing, afraid of not knowing how to be the father you needed. But none of those fears matter anymore. I can't change yesterday, but I can be here today, and tomorrow, and every day after, if you let me. The boy studied him, silent for what felt like forever, then handed him a crayon. You can draw with me, then. It was such a small gesture, yet it felt like the first brick of a bridge being laid between them. Still, shadows lingered. Adrian carried the knowledge of Alara and the child he never met like a wound that never fully healed. He didn't hide it from Marissa. One late night, while the children slept, he told her everything: her sister's anger, the truth about the baby, the crushing guilt. Tears slid down Marissa's face, but she didn't turn away. You can't make peace with ghosts, she whispered, but you can honor them. Don't let their story end in silence. Tell the children one day, when they're old enough to understand. Let them know the cost of disappearing. That way, they'll never repeat it. Her words etched themselves into him, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt that grief could become a guide instead of a chain. Months passed, and the noise of scandal slowly dulled. People grew tired of the story. The headlines shifted to new faces, new mistakes. But in a small corner of the city, a man who once measured life in profits now measured it in moments. A child's laughter, a teacher's praise, Marissa's quiet smile when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun set behind the skyline, Adrian stood at the playground, watching his daughter race down the slide, her giggles filling the air. His son clung to the monkey bars, calling out, "Look at me." And Adrian did. He watched as if nothing else in the world mattered, because for the first time, it didn't. A stranger nearby recognized him and muttered, "That's the CEO who vanished." But another parent replied, "Maybe, or maybe that's just a dad trying to do better." Adrian turned his gaze upward, the last light of day painting the sky in gold and crimson. He would always carry the scars of his mistakes, but now those scars weren't just reminders of what he had lost, they were proof of how far he had come. And though the world might never forget the man who vanished, his children would remember something else entirely, the man who came back and stayed. Asterisk.